So one of the things we would also like to include today are some adaptations and strategies. My specialty is working with English language learners, but these are often very helpful for students who need alternative strategies or a bit more assistance with their reading and writing as well. So one of the things that we're looking at is with the shift to Common Core, with the shift to SAT, we know that our students are reading more complex text than they've ever been asked to before. And they're reading complex text in a variety of genres, which is something that is a new focus for many of them. And in order to read complex texts and engage in academic conversations, your ELs have to have access to those complex texts, and they need the supports so that they can engage in academic discourse and discussion. If we hand a student a text that is clearly above their grade level, and I don't give them support and scaffolds on how to access that text, and we don't talk about it, and we don't build background, and we don't work on some of the vocabulary, that student effectually is blocked from having access to that text. Now, we don't want to simply simplify everything. That's a strategy that can be very helpful when we're teaching new content, but that doesn't help when we're looking at complex text. We have to teach kids how to attack a complex text and what to do with it. So one of the questions that I always ask is, does the text contain one of these three things? Does it contain historical references, cultural references, or a theme that my students are unlikely to have acquired? When we look at this Barbara Jordan text, U.S. history is one of those areas for many of our EL students, they do not have background in it. And government processes in the U.S., that's another area that our students lack background in. So these are things that we know we're going to have to provide some background before they read it. Now clearly, what do they do on test day? We hope that we've given them enough strategies to help with an independent attack of the text. But when we're teaching and practicing in the classroom, we want to do as much scaffolding as we can so that good learners can take that information and then use it independently. So if students are unlikely to have acquired these historical references, cultural references, or themes, we know that we need some background. If you're going to use guided highlighted reading, we know that background information and connections, if you still think text to self, text to world, those types of connections, we have to make those before we embark on a guided highlighted reading passage. And that's a critical piece. For so many of our students, they really don't have a background connection to something that's written as a speech. And that can be an incredibly difficult area. So we'll talk a little bit about speeches too and what you can do for that. Question?
What do you mean by
theme? Social justice, saving the world. Everyone should be green. That's something that definitely for my refugee students that come in, environmental sustainability is really not at the top of their list. They've had some other concerns. And also, it just depends on what country you're from, too, and whether that's a prevalent piece or not. For many of my students from South America, that's incredibly important. For my students from Burma, not so much. And so you really have to take a look at that. Grammatical features of expository text. We're going to take a look at several grammatical features that are common in persuasive text and that patterns that students can identify that can help with some of the linguistic aspects of the language test taking. And then, of course, content vocabulary and academic vocabulary. This is the constant struggle. And one of the things that we know is important is how you select your vocabulary. And this is something that as English teachers, we talk about and talk about and talk about. How do we choose which vocabulary to teach students? There are some shortcuts that we take in the EL world because our students need all of the vocabulary. And so if we were teaching just vocabulary, that would be all that we could teach. So one of those shortcuts that we take is often using tiered vocabulary. So if you're familiar with tiered vocabulary, Tier 1 words are those concrete nouns, easy to explain, simple verbs, things that I can point to. Table, computer, cup, run, jump, happy, sad. Those are all Tier 1 words. Tier 2 words are the words that we spend more time on. Those are the words like justify and define and rationalize. Those are the words that are academic vocabulary that cross subjects, and students are going to find them year after year after year. So that's where we target most of our time. Tier 3 words, however, is unfortunately where some people end up targeting their time. Those are words that are subject specific, and they do not come about very often. So things like spectrometer is something that you might be using for one lesson in science, but students aren't going to go out and talk about it. They're not going to read about it in English. They're not going to deal with it in history and social studies. Bayonet is another one. I was just working with a Revolutionary War piece. Bayonet is a word that the teacher was spending a lot of time on, but that's not something that was going to be helpful in other subject areas for their students. So Tier 2 is really where we hit. But here's the problem. So I ran the Barbara Jordan speech through a tool online from Achieve the Core that will take, you can copy and paste your text, and it will find all of your Tier 2 vocabulary words for you. So you don't have to do it. And this is from Achieve the Core. It's called Word Finder, and it's in the Google resource document. There's a link to it. And with Achieve the Core, you do need to sign up for a free account. It came up with the words in red. But with our ELs, we also use another source called the Academic Word List, and that's because our ELs often lack a broad exposure, and so we have to teach much more. When I run the same speech through our Academic Word List highlighter, I get different words. So one of the things you have to consider is when you're going to do guided highlighted reading or any other strategy, which vocabulary are you using? How are you selecting it? Where are you spending your time? There is some overlap here, but there's also quite a bit that's not, and that's because the Academic Word List takes a look at broad exposure to academic terminology and academic background, where Tier 2 is more of a focus on English speakers and academic vocabulary. So there can be a difference. The third piece that I did want to talk about under this strategy is teaching speeches. Teaching speeches and teaching rhetoric is something that's new for a lot of kids. This is not something they've had a lot of instruction in. They may have given speeches, but studying and analyzing and interpreting a speech can be a difficult thing. So a few of the things that we do in our EL world, which may be helpful to others as well, are teaching things like rhetorical devices and the rule of 3. Now, if you're teaching oral comm or speech, you're teaching the rule of 3 all the time. But our kids are really good at patterns. If you teach them a pattern, they can find a pattern. So a rule of 3, which is also tricolon, is when you have 3 points in a row. Now, you can also do things like repeat the same 3 words in a row. That's a different piece. But Vini Vidi Vici from Caesar, be sincere, be brief, and be candid from Roosevelt. Love that one. That was his advice to his son in public speaking. And then, of course, from the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln talking about the field. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. So the rule of 3 is a good thing to teach your kids because they can look for it and look for a pattern. Word parts and suffixes, when we look at TION or SION, this is what turns verbs into nouns. And that's a good pattern to teach your EL students because that allows them to further access words that they may not have seen before. And so if I look at subversion, I had the word subvert, and then I use SION, and it turns into being able to lower in character, dignity, or quality. And then finally, degrees of words, sometimes we call it shades of meaning as well, is when you teach kids that, yes, we have a word called happy, but I could also be glad or content or happy or excited. And you teach it there are degrees and nuances in between those vocabulary words, that one doesn't just mean the same as everything else. And partially this is involved in synonyms and antonyms, but it's about nuance, and that's often what our kids miss. So when they're looking at a speech and they look at the kind of language that Barbara Jordan used, it's very important to understand the degrees of meaning, that she's incredibly serious about this, that this is something incredibly critical and important to her, and that this is something serious to the country as well. So these shades of meaning, degrees of words, the best way to do this is to use paint chips. And if you have a paint chip sample, and then you can write the different words on the different colors, that's a great thing. And you can steal a lot of paint chips before they kick you out. So you really can. You have to go different places, though. So just don't go to one store all the time, because they catch on to that. Yeah, take your kids. That's great. Get your kids to take them, too. That's a wonderful thing. So those are some things that you can do with highlighted guided reading and speeches that will hopefully be helpful for you. So with that, I'm going to turn you back over to discussion with Mark.
Okay, so literally then, as we did after doing that piece, you had a chance to kind of see and hear a little bit about the guided highlighted reading. Go ahead and look at that online. I always am asked when I typically present, that's nice, I have a lot of English language learner students, what would you suggest for them? And now I can go, Casey's right after me, so it's perfect. So that's what we would suggest. So you had a chance to hear that perspective. So keeping that in mind, we'd like you to consider the following questions. What information or skills will students need to navigate the text? What implications will this have in your current instruction? And what other strategies, ideas, or resources could you use to support students with this text, right? You're coming in with your own skill set, so what are things you might want to share with the people at your table or us as a larger group? So we want to let you have that dialogue. Carol. Sure.
Question coming after that was dependent on one before.
Right.
Can you go back to the previous question?
I don't know officially because it's never been in, well, yeah, you would be able to because they're all going to be right there following in order. Yeah. Yep. So, yep. So, any other questions you might have? All right, go ahead and dialogue at your tables about the strategies and ideas, and we'll come back together in 5 minutes and have a share out from each of the table, or 3 different tables. Thanks.